Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to Shrink Think, which is the podcast of the Association for MPD and Psychopathy Survivor Treatment, Research, and Education. We produce this podcast mostly for therapists as an introduction and better understanding of the emerging field, counseling field of narcissistic and psychopathic abuse. I am Sandra Brown. I am the president of the association and also the director over at the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction. And I'm joined each time with my co-host, Shelley Pumphrey. Hey, Shelley.
Hi, Sandra. Excited to be here today.
I know it. Tell everybody a little bit about what you do.
Well, I am a licensed professional counselor in Colorado. I'm in private practice and specializing in narcissistic and pathological love abuse recovery. Do a lot of work with trauma and am a board member here on the board with Sandra and have also written the book Insight is 2020, How to Trust Yourself to Protect Yourself from Narcissistic Abuse and Toxic Relationships. So
And
here we are.
and that what I find really exciting is your new ketamine work. You
Right.
might tell people about that.
Sure. Yeah. As somebody who's worked with trauma for about 30 years, I have seen a lot of people grow, but I was introduced to, well, I got very interested in psychedelics for trauma treatment and the depression of other mental health conditions like depression and anxiety, and have just been incredibly impressed by the catalytic nature, I'll say, of psychedelics to help people do deeper healing and more effective healing. Kind of has a way of getting us out of our own way or seeing things in new perspectives, and also, especially with ketamine, in reducing symptoms of trauma, depression, and anxiety. So I offer ketamine at this moment, and when things are more legal, we'll also be able to offer psychedelic, well, psilocybin treatments in Colorado, as we're awaiting some guidelines, and possibly other things down the line as the FDA clears and approves things.
That's exciting. So I'm glad you plugged that for therapists who are often looking for that for their
Yeah,
survivors.
very helpful.
Well, today I'm excited because we're switching it up a little bit, and we have somebody joining us today. Um, we are joined today by Kate Amber. She is also an association board member, and as well as an award-winning coercive control expert and consultant. She has been called a personal earth angel. I love that. By those who has worked with her on legal cases, and her very revolutionary Quicksand Model has been awarded the 2024 Domestic Violence Training Program of the Year. That is quite something. Well, welcome, Kate. I'm glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here, and I thank you both for all of the wonderful work that you are both doing to support survivors and therapists and other professionals to understand this really important topic. So thank you for having me. And now I'm all excited to ask you questions about ketamine.
Well, maybe that'll be another podcast we'll do.
Right. Gee, there's a new market, ketamine and quartz.
That's
Ooh.
a whole thing that I actually would love to talk to you about. So, yeah.
Yeah. Um, well, your expertise is in the field of coercive control, and probably many of our listeners might be unfamiliar with that term of coercive control. So, can you give us a little bit the easy to understand definition of that?
Sure. And that's what Akusa does. We try to take this really complicated, complex, and nuanced subject and simplify it and make it easy to understand so that people can see it and detect it and hopefully prevent it. And so I define coercive control as the pattern of behavior that establishes and maintains oppression. And there are lots of other definitions that would be accurate, but that definition simplifies it down to what I feel is the very core of what the pattern is designed to do. It's designed to oppress and subjugate another person or a group of people for the purpose of abusing power over that person or persons.
And what does ACUSA stand for?
Yeah, it's End Coercive Control USA.
Okay, great, great. Yeah. And that's not relegated as a concept just in the United States, right?
Oh, certainly not. As a matter of fact, coercive control as a concept, and then first, when it was first criminalized, was criminalized in the UK. And it was the Serious Crime Act of 2015 is where coercive control was codified in their law and first criminalized in those countries. And so in the US, we didn't have any coercive control laws when I started in Coercive Control USA. And so I wanted to bring the concept to the US so that we could bring that whole framework, because there are these misunderstandings about domestic violence, and how and the intentionality of perpetrators. And so this framework of coercive control gives us a much more effective lens through which to view things like narcissistic abuse, psychopathic abuse, and then just a pattern of behavior used to dominate others.
Sounds really interesting. I did not know that it had started over in some European countries, and that I'm not surprised that it hasn't been here yet, though. So it's interesting
None
to.
of us are, right?
Well,
Right.
and let me just say there are currently between 5 and 7 states in the US that have codified coercive control in the law, but only in one state has it been criminalized, and that's in Hawaii, where it's simply a misdemeanor.
Wow.
And what we really need is a law that criminalizes it not only in domestic violence, domestic abuse arena, but across contexts, so that perpetrators are held accountable for the severity of the harm that coercive control causes to the victims. And so right now we just don't have those laws in place yet. And that's one of the things that I think is really important that we need to work on.
And how will that happen?
Well, it's a long process.
Right,
So,
right.
so in the US, the way that it's happening currently is it's going state by state. So we don't have, whereas like in the UK, they were able to pass it, sort of federally overarching way for everyone. In the US, we go state by state. And so each state, you have to go through the same process as you would to pass any law. And of course, there's an enormous amount of resistance by those in power
Of course.
to not have a law that prevents them from abusing their power. So it's taking a long time. We have laws in Hawaii, Connecticut, California, Washington, and a few other states. And there are several states that are sort of in process, but it takes a long time. And that's just to get it passed. That has nothing to do with the really tough part, which is to get it implemented in an effective way where it's
Right.
actually being applied properly.
Right.
So we have a long way to go, but we are making progress. So there's hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell
Ha-
us a little bit about why this is so important to you?
Um, well, I've been a target of coercive control a couple of times in my lifetime. Um, and I was kidnapped by my father when I was 7. He took my brother and I to a foreign country, and it took nearly a year for our mother to bring us back to the States. I understand the ways that children might adapt to that situation, where they might identify with the aggressor, as I did. I identified with my dad, and I felt like he was the one who was in the right. And it took me many years to realize that the reason why I identified with him was because he was the powerful one. And I didn't want to identify with the victimized party. So I aligned with him. I also, there's also this sort of Disney dad thing that can occur. And I don't mean to imply that coercive control is only ever perpetrated by men, but that it is primarily perpetrated by men, and victims are primarily women. And so the Disney dad idea is that the offending parent, the abusive parent, will often use bribes and give the kid whatever they want and let them stay up all night and play video games to their heart's content and eat all the junk food they can stand, because that parent doesn't really care about the child. That parent has decided to weaponize that child against their adult victim as a way to punish them. So that piece, having been through that myself, not only as a child, but then as an adult, having been targeted by coercive control as an adult, I started trying to find out what exactly had happened to me. Like, domestic violence books didn't seem to quite cover it. There was something else, something more, something more insidious and strategic and intentional. And I hate to use the word evil because it sounds exaggerated, but when you look at some of the things, and now that I've worked with close to 100 clients, it starts to look evil.
Mhm.
And whether the person is evil or not is not the point. The point is whether the behavior that they're perpetrating is an evil behavior, and the extreme harm that it causes to the victim. So that's why it's important to me. I don't want anyone else to have to go through what I've gone through. And so I want to be able to help those who are trying to escape it, and who are trying to prevent it and detect it wherever it happens, regardless of the context in which it's occurring.
And so, how does this overlap or differ from the concepts that most of us have been trained in domestic violence? We grew up in that model. And granted, that's an old model now, 50 years old or something. So, how does coercive control piggyback that, overlap that, or is different from that?
Well, there's a lot of overlap. And some would say, some experts say, as like Evan Stark, who wrote the book Coercive Control, he essentially believed that domestic abuse, and he died a few months ago. So,
Okay.
but in his work, he essentially felt that domestic abuse and coercive control were the same thing. But the addition of the coercive control framework was essentially to help bring out these distinctions that the industry, that the systems didn't quite understand. The systems weren't understanding this systemic and this pattern of behavior. They were, and they still are in most cases, identifying domestic violence based on single incidents of physical violence. And that's not the way that coercive control really works.
Right.
You know, coercive control is, it's a whole pattern of other things. And the violence is really just sort of these little exclamation points along the way. They may use violence initially to terrify the person so that then they don't have to use it again. They can just use the threat of it later. And then the whole rest of the relationship might just be, I hate to, don't mean to say just, but it might be emotional, psychological abuse, gaslighting, and those things. The physical violence was just this sort of real fear inducer, and it keeps the person in this state of terror where they always know that if they don't do what the person demands, that they are there's a high potential that they will be retaliated against in the most awful way possible. And so the pattern piece, I think, is the main distinction in the way that looking at domestic violence versus looking at coercive control. But the other piece, I think, is really that there are all these other behaviors that may not be physical violence that we need to consider as red flags, and that we need to see those early so that we can prevent it from escalating to suicide, homicide, suicide.
Right.
Yeah. So go ahead,
Yeah,
Sam.
good. And I've kind of thought about this introduction of the concept of coercive control as the furthering of our understanding and theory 50 years later. That just like in any science, and we hope that we are always recognizing more and flushing out the theories more, over time and over the generations. And I was really excited to see the use of that kind of language, and then this broader view of really understanding that concept. I think a lot of us, have felt like that the original standing, DV model was good in the beginning when that's all we understood. And that as psychology as a science, continues to grow, we learn more, and our theories and understandings of it should grow. So I was excited to see you know an expansion, I guess, of that in a deeper framework and understanding of what's underneath that, beyond just, the power and control wheel that we were taught, which was pretty surface. So
Right.
I'm glad to see all this.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
Joy,
That really is, it's really a flushing out. Like
yeah,
we're filling in the pieces, and we're also addressing some of the things are that are misconceptions that the domestic violence model didn't get quite right. One of the things they didn't quite get quite right was they tended to blame the victim for being trapped. And now we have a much better understanding of how that victim got trapped, and that
right.
they were targeted. They didn't intentionally walk into the quicksand. It was invisible on the surface. They couldn't see it. And that's how they got stuck there. It's not because they were codependent, not that they couldn't have been, because some are codependent going in, but codependency is kind of a result of coercive control, not a
Yeah,
cause of being coercively controlled.
that's right.
Absolutely. You know, you've kind of talked a little bit about this here, but I am curious about why it's so hard for us to get this or to see how coercive control, I mean, that it even exists in the first place.
Yeah. And so coercive control has been said in the research by many researchers that coercive control is invisible in plain sight. And that's because there are a lot of social and structural factors that are keeping it in place and that allow for coercive controllers to exploit systems. And so that's one of the things that that my model intends to do, is to make the invisible visible. And the way we do that is through training professionals in different areas, whether that be in businesses or in the domestic violence field or human trafficking, because all of these places coercive control can happen in, because anywhere that a person has the ability to abuse power, coercive control can exist. And so we try to, a model simplifies down the tactics and the goals so that people can see it. And then there's still a lot more to do once you've found it. But the first step is in being aware that it's happening and recognizing it, so that those of us who are not on that side, who don't have that domination mindset and don't want to subjugate other people, and we really have a more egalitarian and equality mindset, there's more of us than there are the domination folks. And if we can get together and stand up for one another, then we can help hold these people accountable and put barriers in place so that they cannot do the harm that they're doing.
And we've had abuse laws on on the books. The DV field's, 50 years old now. So what are we missing? So what's the problem?
Well, I think mainly it's that the domestic violence focus from the very beginning was on physical violence. Well, as you said, we've had this research, and we've been putting laws and such in place for 50 years or so. Well, coercive controllers are very savvy and adapt to the situation. And so they are like, oh, well, I can't slap her. What can I do? And they just use some other tactic that isn't physical violence because they know that they can get away with it. And so we need to find a way to get the systems to understand that, because now the amount of physical violence is typically going down, but the amount of psychological, emotional violence, these tactics are being used more and more. There were a couple of homicide reviews done in Australia where they found coercive control as a pattern in 99% of the cases prior to the homicide or the homicide suicide. And so coercive control is a huge red flag for homicide, which is why the UK passed the Serious Crime Act and included that to begin with, included coercive control, was because they wanted to reduce homicides. But like in the US, where we don't have it as a crime, as they can do whatever they want as long as they don't touch you.
Right.
And they can you can totally destroy a person without physical violence. And we need to get that more recognized.
Yeah, and that certainly is the overlap, with pathological partners, is that especially white collar. So the higher, often the career status, the least they can afford a DV charge or an arrest. And you know, with pathological people, they're creative in ways of control. And certainly, you know, they're the masterminds, and you know, gaslighting and all of that. So I definitely saw those patterns, that the higher the career status, the white collar career status, the least likely they were, unless they completely snapped, um, to use violence. So they used all the other psychological and emotional and financial and
Yeah, exactly. Well, and
ways.
in those two homicide studies, in the first one, which was done, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, they found that 30% of those cases of homicide or homicide suicide had no physical violence before the murders.
Mhm.
In the second one, 75% had no physical violence before the murders. And what that's telling me is that the research is indicating that physical violence is being used less and less. And if we're going to protect victims, targeted victims from this, we're going to have to start detecting it earlier before any physical violence has happened.
Absolutely. So important.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, Kate, one of the things that we've heard you talk about with your quicksand model, maybe you can introduce this quicksand model and tell us a little bit about this idea of the D's, E's, F's, and I's.
Sure. So first off, the quicksand model, I created it as a way, I was preparing for some speeches, some presentations that I was doing nationally and internationally a few years ago. And I was trying to find a way to simplify it, because it is very complex and nuanced. And so I created these alliterations. So the D's, the E's, the F's, and the I's to make it really straightforward and simple. And then the overarching idea of the quicksand is it's a metaphor for what it feels like to the person who's trapped, because
Right.
coercive control entraps a person and then exploits them for their resources. And then if they try to escape, the coercive controller escalates their tactics to prevent that person from escaping. So those are the E's. First, we have ensnare. So they ensnare the target, and they do that using what I call the mirage. And the mirage is a combination of a few tactics. It's a combination of love bombing. I prefer the term manipulative kindness because it's a little more accurate,
Yeah.
but love bombing, future faking, where they paint this beautiful, perfect future that hits all your buttons, right? They listen really carefully to you, and then they design this perfect future to prevent you from seeing the quicksand, the dangerous quicksand of coercive control that's behind that mirage. And so love bombing, future faking, and then mirroring. And in mirroring, they match your tone of voice, your cadence, they match your values and beliefs. They do everything they can to make themselves look like your perfect match. And so those three things create this mirage, and that is what is used to ensnare the person into the quicksand initially. So ensnare is the first, then we have entrap, then we have exploit. So many coercive controllers exploit their targeted victims by having them do all of the emotional labor and all of the housework and all of the childcare. And maybe their target is also working full time. And so they hardly have they don't even have any time to process what's happening to them
Yeah.
because they're so overwhelmed and overworked. So after exploit, that's usually when the target starts to wake up and realize something's not right here. They may not know what it is, but they start to wake up. And then they, at some point, realize they want to try to escape. And when they do try to escape, the coercive controller escalates their tactics, which is the next E, to prevent escape. And if they do escape, then there's a couple of E's that occur afterward to either try to drag them back in or to punish them for having left. So those are the E's. And then we've got the D's, which are tactics. We have the, so the E's were the goals. The D's are the tactics. The F's are the methods, and those are force, fraud, and fear. And then the I's are those things that are in the coercive control laws. It's a shorthand for the laws. So we have isolate, intimidate, and then we have inequality and indignity. And those are the 4 I's that sort of mirror the aspects of the laws in the states in the US that we have laws in.
I love that. It does. It makes it not only easy to understand, but easy to remember. Using that. I like that.
Thanks.
So in your model, what does your work encompass? How do you work with survivors or with professionals? What does your work encompass?
So it kind of depends on which context they're in. If they are a survivor who is in a custody battle with a coercive controller, then on that side of things, I do assessments, I do expert witness testimony, and I do consulting with those folks to help them to navigate that system. But for the professional side, I do the training through the Quicksand model. I teach whether it's a group of therapists or if it's an organization that's having difficulty where there is a coercive controller in the organization and they need someone to come in and help the team recognize these tactics. And then the team can hopefully, I can work with them to put protections in place so that they can prevent it from continuing and so they can find ways to stop it. So those are some of the ways that I work with folks. And I offer free consultations on my website for survivors on the Survivor tab, and for churches or groups or organizations or businesses that are dealing with someone abusing power in their midst. They can bring me in to do training and to do turnaround and help reverse that downward spiral and get it moving in the right direction.
Well, and I know, I mean, this comes up in the association with, therapists we have trained. It is that whole legal piece, that's not what we're good at. That's not what we're trained in. We're always, at least I have been, always looking for resources, for court. So what do you do as an expert witness if our survivors needed that?
So I used to do the assessments and then provide a report to the court and testify. But what I have moved to is subject matter testimony. And as a subject matter witness, I can provide information and education to the court about the things that the court commonly gets backwards. And so I can answer questions on the stand about typical perpetrators' patterns, typical traits of a coercive controller, their lack of empathy, their high entitlement, which of course is where the overlap happens with pathology. And some of these coercive controllers are pathological, and some of them are just using our societal structures to
Right.
take advantage of their partner or ex-partner. So I kind of got a little off track. Did I get to your question?
What you do in court that's beneficial for the survivors. So that,
Yes.
yeah.
So as a subject matter witness, I can answer those general questions, give the context, and help put the context back in, because what coercive controllers love to do is to pull out the context, and try to make whatever, like, especially when the person they have targeted fights back, and maybe they use physical violence to fight back. That's because of our single incident perspective. The court's going to see those two things as equal. If he slapped her because she didn't do the dishes right, and she slapped him to get him out of the way because she was trying to get away from him because he was trying to strangle her, the court sees those as equal. Those are not equal. One is a perpetration, an intentional act to harm the other, and the other is an act of self-defense and protection. And so as a subject matter witness, I can sort of explain that we need to be able to look at the entire context to understand what's really going on here. And so I can answer those general questions, and then I can also answer hypothetical questions to get case details in that need to be brought in.
And what kind of outcomes have you seen? I mean, a lot. I know for myself the utter frustration of the attorneys and then the judges on top of that. So, is this making a difference in the cases to bring in an expert like you?
So it's slow going. We have a long way to go. And at the same time, I've had several cases where the testimony, where my client got much better results than what they had been getting previously, because of the additional information that the judge was then able to see it through this new perspective that helped them to see what's usually invisible to them. And there are cases where it hasn't been helpful. So as I said, there's a long way to go. We have no guarantee, and judges have discretion, which of course judges need to have discretion so that they can judge the cases on a case-by-case basis. But the problem is that they pretty much have unlimited discretion. And there are not structures in place for effectively holding them accountable when they make an error, whether that error was because of a lack of information or whatever reason. We need a way to be able to hold them accountable so that victims can be protected inside this system. And we don't really have those right now. But there are things that are moving. Caden's law, for instance, is a law that's being passed that is supposed to be helping. And it's brand new where it is. It's only passed in a few states. And it's too early to tell how much of an impact it's going to have. But it is a route to go that wasn't there before in the states that have it.
Well, and because everybody doesn't know what that is, you might say what Caden's law is.
Sure. Cadence law is related to, it's part of the Violence Against Women reauthorization that happened. I believe it was March of 2022 that VAWA passed Cadence law as part of that reauthorization. And it is intended to protect survivors in custody cases from pseudoscientific things like parental alienation.
Right,
And to prevent there's 4 things that it requires. And I don't know them off the top of my head, but one of them has to do with outlawing reunification camps.
right,
Because what a reunification camp is when an abuser says to the court, I'm not an abuser. She's alienated me from the children. And if the court buys that argument and determines that, oh, it's very important this child have a relationship with that parent, then the court can order this reunification camp. And then these kids are essentially ordered into an abusive environment where they're being forced to reunify with an abuser. They're being forced to rewrite their own truth of their own memory of the harms done to them. And they're being forced to say that their protective parent is the abusive one. And if they don't do whatever the reunification camp folks are demanding that they do, then some of these children are unable to then see their protective parent until they
right.
do.
Yeah.
And it's
So-
absolutely egregious.
Mhm.
But so that's part of Cadence law, is to say that, okay, you can no longer order this in a court order.
Mm.
But unfortunately, people just take them to another state where it's not outlawed.
Mm.
So we really need it. We need it in every state in the country. And as I said, I think there's only 2 states that have passed it in full, and maybe 5 that have passed it with either in full or in part so far.
Mhm. Wow. Is there anything else that we haven't touched on, kind of in regards to ICUSA and how you're working to end coercive control? Is there any other aspects we haven't discussed?
We've gone into a lot of what the model does. And I guess one piece that is something that I've incorporated in the last 6 months or so is a concept from Rian Eisler, who created the domination partnership continuum.
Mm.
And it's an even more simplified than my DZs and Fs. And so I kind of see that domination partnership paradigm as sort of the top level of the continuum, from partnership and cooperation and egalitarianism to the most extreme subjugation, domination, oppression mindset. And so that's kind of where I start with the training is, okay, here's the high level. Coercive control is a pattern of behavior used to dominate, subjugate, and to oppress others. And then we do the D's, E's, F's, and I's so that they can get the more detail of it. And then we talk about, okay, how can we move either our group, our family, our system as far away from the domination as we can, and as close as we can get to equality and cooperation and these egalitarian systems. And so that's kind of the sort of the process through which I see helping survivors to escape, helping organizations to transform. My hope and the goal of ACUSA is systemic transformation from that domination idea to as close as we can get to this much more egalitarian idea of partnership.
Well, I'm just really amazed at the depth that this model has been able to take old theory to. Yeah, and so impressed with that. How can people get in touch with you? Survivors or therapists?
Sure, yeah. So my website is endcoercivecontrolusa.com. And if you can't remember that, or if you can't spell that, quicksandmodel.com will get you there too. And on the website, I have a resources page that has a ton of resources for survivors, for professionals, for researchers. And then there are 2 tabs on there where you can book a free consultation, the survivor tab, the professional tab. You can book free consultations with me to see if either my consulting on an individual basis, or if bringing a CUSA in for your organization is a good fit or not. You can also follow me on Instagram, on Twitter, on LinkedIn. I refuse to call it X on Twitter. I really liked the little bird, and now now there's this big X and the screen is always black. And anyway, but there are little snippet videos on TikTok. So if you want really short little snippets of the model, that's the place to go, is to find a CUSA on TikTok, and you can see them there.
Awesome.
Definitely post some of your links below after the video so people can access you easily there too.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you for joining us today. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. This work is so important, and I am like, I wish everybody could see this and be trained in it, and we just got to keep fighting the good fight here.
Thank you so much for having me. And I love participating on the board with the association. And I'm so grateful for all that you both do as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for joining us. Check out our other videos that we have done at Shrink Think on YouTube. This has been the association.